Welcome, my friends and fellow brigaders, fellow MERP enthusiasts. Middle Earth role-playing game system started in the early '80s by Iron Crown Enterprises, and now continued in various uh, revisions and redundant stuff that's similar but not quite similar by other people. Right? Okay, it is what it is. Welcome to my subscribers. I appreciate you guys and. We're not in this for the money. Obviously, I'm not gonna see the millions of hits that some of these other guys seem to be blessed with. That's okay. My intention is to continue to share my interest in the hobby that we share, my little corner of it, the stuff that I really enjoy, and fortunately or unfortunately, how you look at it, the fact that majority of my stuff is 20 years out of date. So for some of you, it's brand new, never been seen before. That's all good and awesome. Like I said, this is my base of operations where I work, the shop that we use to park the truck in. That's the beast behind me. You've seen me do a few vlogs, may or may not have seen me do a few vlogs from the cab. It's just a little piece of quiet here before I go in. We're living in our RV, as I've said before, and it's a little cramped. And the wife's set in her ways, and she's a little cheesed if I ask her to shut up so I can do one of these things, because she don't get it, she don't understand it. It's all good, right? This is another module called the Dark Mage of Rhudaur. Okay. Rhudaur is one of the three splinter kingdoms of Arnor. They're sisters to Cardolan and to Arthedain. It is the smallest of the three, the weakest of the three, and the one that's the first one to fall to the Witch King. It falls under his control, under the Witch King control, and then later just becomes absorbed by the Witch Queen. One of the downsides for Rhudaur is that the true-blooded Dunedain, the leader, the ruling class of Arnor, if you will, and of Gondor, there's only 30 or 60 families left in this. They was never very populous in this region. It's pretty rough. The north to the north of them is the Ittendales and the Trollmoors, or whatever it's called, and so the place where a lot of trolls obviously exist, and it's pretty rough terrain right before you get to the Misty Mountains. Not a lot of good farmland and grazing land. They got a nice little map here of the region, as typical of I.C.E. They give us a little different layout to the more localized map on the back page. I like the maps and color because, it just, I don't know, they just seem so much more impressive than what they are in black and white, although even the black and white ones that they do give are pretty decent. They're usable. The base premise in this module, and like I said before, typical of I.C.E., this is getting into the early 90s, the late 80s. Sometimes I'm just basing it off of, 89. At some point, the writers or the new writers that went to work for I.C.E. started to aping or mimicking a lot of the standard module formats that you find in Dungeons and Dragons and other game systems of the time. What they set these apart, they're not as descriptive as the earlier versions of these, where they go into a little better depth and detail on the region as to where you're at, because that's what's one of the things about Middle Earth, is the fact it is Middle Earth, and so we have a very well established, well defined world that you're playing in. You're going to game in it, so you know it. You got the the layout, you got the flavor and the spirit of the place. We got the movies and the books to fall back on, lots of material. So they try to keep in that, but they were in it for the money, and they were trying to put out as much material as they could in a fairly quick manner. So like I said, there's a cookie cutter approach to a lot of modules I've noticed over the years. Now, you might debate me. I'm welcome. Hey, in the comments, debate me. Tell me off. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm wrong. I'm sorry, but your Pathfinder modules, I've ganched a couple of those at the shelf on the store, and they're not all that different than the D&D modules from 30 years ago. The material is a little newer, the style is a little different, the artwork's better, I'll grant you that, but the base concept and the storylines behind them, they're ageless. basically a lot of it's rehashed and recooked over stuff. So in this particular case, what we got here, the premise is you've got a series of beacon forts, small fortifications that are trying to protect the borders of Cardolan and Arthedain from Rhudaur and or the client state of Rhudaur and its master, the Witch-king of Angmar. The gist here is that your people are either part of the garrison or swept up in a rage, what they call a raid force that sweeps down with the intention of wiping out as many of these things as they can, and your guys get caught up in the middle of it. So you're fighting, your group's fighting for survival, and or they're defending a piece of turf. Like I said, if you're playing a short campaign, this is the good way to say, okay, you're all members of this garrison, and your job's to hold out until reinforcements can arrive, and hope you can survive the encounter. And so they break it up in typical fashion. That you've got a number of chapters or mini adventures that are interconnected to some degree. They do give you, there's an introduction to the border war that's going on. It talks about the Angle peoples of the frontier, the Little War. If you look at the timeline of the wars in Middle Earth, they took place over very long periods of time. The battles in Arnor in the north, Angmar, was better part of 900 years. When you look at it from beginning to end, from initial investment to the collapse of both Arthedain, the last surviving kingdom of Arnor, and Angmar itself, and the withdrawal of the Witch King and his forces by Sauron, was just around, like I said, about 900 years. And so a lot of generations, that's all they knew. And so your player character's in the middle of this. The same goes on in Gondor. Gondor was beset by enemies year after year after year. They seem to come in waves. There'd be decades of peace or somewhat peace and prosperity, followed by, lots of war and lots of attrition. Now, some of it was slow and steady. Some of it was huge and massive. Rare was the encounters like we see in the Battle of Daggerlad or the Battle of Minas Tirith. Those encounters, or the Battle at Helm's Deep, are rare in volume, the sheer size of the scope of that battle, but they weren't totally unique. If you read the history books and the history material that's provided both by Iron Crown and by the Tolkien estate, there is slew of timelines where we've seen invasion after invasion after invasion defeated or thwarted or not so much thwarted by the forces of good. This is the story of the Riders of Rohan, how they came to be located where they are. There was, a major invasion taking place, and the armies of Gondor were not quite on the ropes, but they weren't having a good day in the field, and Rohan rides to their, the future Rohirrim ride to their rescue. That's just repeated over and over and over again. The thing with it is, over time, the Dark Lord played the long game. He played the long game. He knew that he could, through time, wear these people down. And it happened. Time we get to the Lord of the Rings, everything seems to be on the ropes or on the way out. Everything's worn out or old or broken and depopulated and so on and so forth. Well, this is why. And then these modules and these source books help perpetrate the story. If you're a big fan of the Tolkien story, even the material, just reading it, I gain so much more information from these things, more of the source books than these, that tell me the true story in depth. So when I watch the movies, I understood it better. When I read the books, and I've read them over many, 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 many times. I'm not exaggerating when I've said I've read them at least once a year for 40 years, so at least 40 times plus, right? Because I like the book so much. It's just, why buy something if you're not going to go back and reread it? That's my philosophy. So we talk about the adventures in Rhudaur, before the snow falls, the Dagger's First, the Gathering Storm, the stuff leading up to the major encounter, the major the minor major raid that's going to make everybody stand up and take notice, dealing with the Danish war bands and the NPCs. You've got some nice little villages from the hillmen and the more rustic human tribes or races, if you will. Lots of NPCs in here. Good stuff. Like I say over and over again, I like these things because they make ready-made material for other game systems that I need to tap into it. I've heard some people poo-poo that. Well, I don't like it. Said, you know, hey, you got the time and the energy to create all this stuff from scratch, day after day, month after month. Awesome. And if you don't, there's no rules, no reason, no rhyme, and no crime involved in tapping into other resources. Make use of them. Why buy them if you're not going to reuse them, right? You know, we got some good stuff, some good character class here. We've got the Siege of Tirith. Major personalities and groupings of people involved in the Siege of Tirith are briefly described below. There's a couple Dunedain descendants, the ruling class, several who were pretenders, and then a lot of rank and file, and so on and so forth. The task here is the player should arrive at Tirith in time to be caught in the siege. In Ethel's schemes include 4 phases: nightfall, battle, striking back, and the grand assault that will transpire as the tower falls, though maybe not in that order. Each scenario places its own demands on the party, but overriding task throughout the adventure is to save Tirith, which is you're trying to save this place from that big horde that wants to bring it down to its knees and burn it out and kill everybody in it. So there's your encounters, in Nightfall, the Battle of Tyrion. So we get the layout of the fort, the layout of their location, the talk about striking back. In the average siege, defenders usually launch a stroke or 2 against the foes. A raid might be needed to restore morale after the battle, although to some it may have seemed a good means of avoiding participation in the battle in the first place. Once the Orc war miners have siege engines built, have started to find their a raid to destroy them becomes a necessity. Upper walls of Tyrion are too thin. So there's an example why it's giving you one good reason why you would send your guys out to raid. So, yeah, and then of course the aftermath. So that's basically, in a nutshell, as an individual short-term campaign. I ran this at least one time as a short-term campaign by itself, as members of the garrison defending the keep and trying to save the major NPCs here. As far as I remember, they didn't do so hot. But hey, that was the whole point. We were running a game that was only going to be for a couple weekends, and I think that's what it ran, was 2 weekends. Still. We've got a lot of enjoyment out of it. Good stuff. Like I said, if you ain't seen it, you ain't bought it.